Gittin Daf Aleph begins with a discussion about what happens if a husband puts a get in a place and then transfers ownership of that place to his wife. Does that work as a divorce? And we'll have a few cases of that. And the Gemara will talk about the concept of shlichus, the concept of yad, and the concept of chatzar. Towards the end of the daf, the Gemara will bring a Mishnah, which introduces the concept of a get, which is written on something attached to the ground. So let's begin. Rava says the following scenario: if somebody writes a get and he puts it in the hand of his eved, and then he writes the document that transfers ownership of the eved to his wife, and then he gives it to his wife. So the Gemara says she's kind of the eved because he transferred ownership. He gave her a gift document, and she's also divorced because now that she owns the eved, the get that's in his hand is given to her. It's in her property. Now this works as a concept of chatzar. Chatzar is a yard. If you place something in someone's yard, it's like you place it in his hand. It's like you've given it to him. So the husband put the get in the possession of the eved, and the eved is like the chatzar of the woman. So Gemara asks, the problem is that this chatzar moves. It's if you call the eved a chatzar, it's mobile, and the rule which we have always learned is that a chatzar that moves cannot be kaina for the owner. Only a chatzar which is still and motionless, like a real yard, works that the owner, which in this case is a woman, should take ownership of the document that's put in there. Says Gemara, maybe you'll say that we're talking where the eved is not moving; he's standing still. That's no good because Rava clearly said that the ability to move is the problem. As long as he could move, even if he's not moving, it still counts as a chatzar melachas. It's a mobile chatzar, and it's no good. So says the Gemara that the halacha is that we were talking about when he's tied up. He's tied up; he can't move at all. Now, this is Rava's first mimer, where he gave the get to an eved and transferred ownership of the eved to his wife. Similar case Rava brings is he put the get in an actual yard, and then he transferred ownership of the yard to his wife. Again, he wrote a gift document and gave the gift document to her. Says Rava, same halacha. She's kind of the yard, she's kind of the get that's in, and she's divorced. Says the Gemara, why'd I have to say both of these? Gemara says there's a chiddush in each of them. If he would only say the case of the eved, I would not know that the yard works, because I may think it shouldn't work, gzeira, because in a different similar case it doesn't work. What's that case? That's if the husband puts the get in a third party's yard. Let's say he puts it in his friend's yard, and then that friend transfers ownership of the yard to the wife, not his own wife, the wife of the person who wrote the get. In that case, it's definitely not going to work. Why? Because how should it work? The husband gave the get, but he didn't give it to the woman. He gave the get to his friend. And the friend transferred the get to the woman, but the friend is not the husband. So what he did doesn't count for anything. So at no point was the get given from the husband to the wife. So that definitely doesn't work. So you may think, because that doesn't work, if the husband puts it in his own yard and transfers that to the wife, that we should make a gzeira and not let that work either, lest we get confusion to the case with the friend. No, we don't say that. Now, if he would have said the case of the chatzar, I would not know that the case of the eved works as well, because I may think that we said that he has to be tied up for it to work. We may think, let's make gzeira and not allow it to work when he's tied up. Gzeira to a case where he's not tied up, where it doesn't work. Okay, now Abaya's kasha. Abaya's kasha is that the entire concept of chatzar, that you can be kind of something by it being placed in your yard, is learned out of a pasuk discussing yad, discussing a hand. And therefore, the chatzar has to be similar to a hand. Now let's look at the hand of the woman that's makabel the get, that receives the get. That hand receives it whether she wants to or she doesn't want to. If the husband stuffs it in her hand, a get can be given against her will. Now, the courtyard, though, in this case, the yard, where he puts the document in the yard and he transfers ownership of the yard, he can't force her to take ownership of the yard. He can give her the shtar matana, she can say, I don't want it. And therefore, it's not similar to a hand, and it shouldn't work. If a hand, you cannot include it in the concept of a hand if it cannot be transferred to her possession against her will. Says the Gemara of Simi Bar Ashi has a response to this. He says, there is a concept where you see that a woman can receive a get in a way that only works if she wants it. And that's what's called a shliach lekabal. That's where she makes the messenger that messenger should be her agent and go receive the get. And as soon as it comes to the messenger's hand, it's like it came to her hand. Now, that's optional to her. She can decide to make that messenger. No one can force her to. Yet it works. So therefore, you see that you could receive the get in a way that only works willingly and not against her will. So what's your kasha? So Abaye answers, Abaye says, what are you talking about? That's a shliach. A shliach is not learned out of yad. It doesn't have to be similar to yad. It doesn't have to work bal karcha. That's first of all. Second of all, there is a way in which shlichus l'kabbalah is against the will of the woman, and that's if she's a ketana. Her husband could, her father that is, could be mekabel get on her behalf. And there she has no choice, and there he's working as a sheikh like Kabbalah. So therefore my question stands that you should only, and he's arguing halacha l'maisa, he's saying you should only be able to put the get in a chatzar which is hers, not to transfer possession of the chatzar, because it only works if she agrees and not against her will. The Gemara refers back to the Mishnah where we saw that the husband can write the get on the horn of a cow and give her the cow. And he can write the get on the hand of an eved and give her the eved. So Gemara asks, I understand why he has to give her the whole eved. You can't cut off the eved's hand. It's not allowed, first of all. It's forbidden to cut off someone's hand. And second of all, he would go free if he did, and then he wouldn't be able to give her to him. Give him to her. The question is, though, why don't you just cut off the horn of the cow? Why do you have to give her the whole cow? So Gemara answers, this is the halacha. You can only write something that does not require cutting afterwards. The halacha is, it says, v'chosav v'nasan, write and give. There cannot be any step which is required in between. You cannot be required to cut the horn off the cow before you give it to her. It's got to be that you just go ahead and give her the entire cow. The Gemara now moves on to discuss the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Glili. We saw in our mission, Rabbi Yosef Glili says you cannot write the get not on anything living, not on an eved, not on a cow, and not on food. So the Rabbanan obviously disagree and hold that you can. So you have a machlekes between Rabbi Yosef Glili and the Rabbanan if we're limiting the materials you can write a get on. So we want to know what is the machlekes based on. So the Gemara quotes a brisa. So the brisa says that Rabbi Yosef Glili learns that out of the word sefer. The pasuk says, "V'chasav la sefer krisus v'nasan biyoda." You write for her a book, a sefer. Then we'll discuss what sefer means of separation, and put it in her hand. Sefer means a scroll, parchment of some sort. So that seems to indicate that it has to be a parchment. How do you know it can be written on something else? It says Rav Yosef Glili because it says v'chasav la. You should write and give it. What do you have to say in write and give it? Just say give her a book of separation. Obviously it's written. So the fact that it says v'chasav means that you could do a lot of writing. You could write it on any other surface. So says Gemara, if so, you could write it on any other surface, so why do you need it to say sefer? Why are you limiting it to a book? So Gemara says you have to find the middle ground. It has to be lots of surfaces, not just a book, but it has to be similar to a book. It has to be something which does not have life, not a living thing, and something which is not food. Now, says the Rabbanon, they disagree with that. They say when it says v'sefer, it doesn't mean a book. If it would say, and you should write it in a book, you'd be right. If you would say v'chasav b'sefer, you'd be right. That's not what it means. It means sfiras dvarim. It means relating from the word saper, to tell. It means you should write the saying over of the things that are happening. You should write down the story, as it were, of what's happening over here. And that's what the krisis is. It's describing what this activity is. And therefore, there is no such limud, there is no extra word sefer. So the Gemara says, okay, so according to the Rabbanan, there is no limitation factor, so you don't have to say v'chasav to include other things. And the only reason why we had v'chasav to include things is because of sefer limits it, right? We said sefer means just a parchment. According to the Rabbanan, sefer doesn't mean a parchment. So what do I need v'chasav for? So the Gemara says, v'chasav is to teach me that you can only divorce her with something written. You cannot use money. You can't give her a coin and say you were divorced with this coin. I would think that works, because we have a gzeira, we have a hekesh called v'yatza v'haisa, linking marriage and divorce. Things which work for marriage work for divorce, and therefore, just like you can marry a woman by giving her money, you may think that you can divorce her by giving her money, and therefore we have this drasha to tell me, no, it has to be v'chasav. It has to be learned. It has to be written. It has to be a scroll. It has to be something written. It can't be money. So Gemara says, so where does basically learn that from? That's because it says, mi sefer krisus. The fact that it says sefer close to krisus, again, not from the word sefer. Sefer is to teach me that it limits what it could be on. But the fact that it's sefer krisos, a book of separation, that means that it has to be only a book of separation and no other type of separation. You cannot give her a coin and say that you're divorced with that. So Mara says, according to the Rabbanan, why don't you use that? So Mara says, because krisos is to teach me that there has to be a full separation between them. That is, you can't have a condition that restricts her for the rest of her life. So if he says to her, here's you get on and it's only valid on the condition you never drink wine, or on the condition you never go home, that's restricting her for the rest of her life. She's always bound to him. That is not a valid get at all. If, however, he says it doesn't take effect till 30 days from now, okay, but in 30 days from now she's finished. So fine, so that works. Now, how does we basically know this halacha that it has to be a full separation? So that's because it could have said kares. Chasavah sefer kares. That also means separation. Why does it say krisus? What's the plurality for? So the chachamim don't hold of that drasha, and therefore they can't use it at all. Now we get the next Mishnah, which discusses writing again on something which is attached to the ground, like a leaf or a tree, something that's growing. And the Mishnah opens with contradictory statements, which the Gemara will have to resolve. So the Mishnah, as we've seen elsewhere, there is a limud that you cannot write on something that needs to be detached, as we mentioned earlier on the daf, as far as the horn of a cow. It says v'chasav and asan, you have to be able to give it as soon as it's written. So the Mishnah opens by saying you cannot write on something attached to the ground. Then it says if you did write on something attached to the ground, then you separate. And then you had the witnesses sign and you gave it to her. Here you have a machlekes. The Tanna Kama says it's kosher, that's fine. And this is what's contradicting what we said before. We just said you can't write it if it's attached to the ground. Now we're saying that that's kosher. And Rabbi Yehuda says it's possible. It has to be written and signed after it's detached from the ground. So what we end up with is the Tanna Kama seems to say that you're not supposed to do it, but if you did it, it's okay as long as you separated it from the ground before the signatures. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to separate it from the ground before it's even written. Now, the Mishnah discusses another halacha. It says Rabbi Yehuda B'Mseir says you're not allowed to write on an erased paper or on something called diphthera, which the Gemara will define on the next daf. Both these things are easily forged. You could erase them, change the conditions, and people won't be able to tell that it's erased. The paper that's erased already is because you can clearly see that it was erased before. The signatures of the witnesses also are clearly written on erased areas, and therefore people won't see if you erased again, because it all looks like it was erased. So on that, Rabbi Yehuda B'Mseir says it's possible, and the Chacham say it is kosher. Okay, let's see the Gemara. So the Gemara starts with the contradiction. You started out saying that you're not allowed to write again on something attached to the ground, and then you tell me that if you did, it's kosher. How do you explain that? So the Gemara has two explanations. First one is brought by a number of Amoraim, Rabbi Yehuda named Shmuel, Rav Elazar named Rav Aishia, Rabbi Bar Bachana named Rav Yechanan. All these say that we're talking where the only thing that you wrote while it was attached is what's called a typeface. That is the standard form of the get, which is the same by everyone. There's nothing special about that. You could even print that on a computer. It's the same for everybody. It's not specific to this get. It doesn't contain the names, the date, the place, doesn't contain any of that. All that stuff you're allowed to write while it's attached to the ground. There's no halacha on that. What we're talking about when we said that you have to that it has to be written when it's detached, that's only referring to the specific information. His name, her name, the name of the place, and the name of the and the time, the date. Now, lechatchila, you shouldn't even write the standard form while it's detached, while it's attached, because Xera, you may end up writing the entire thing while it's attached. That's what we started off saying, not to write anything that's attached. If, however, you did, but you only wrote the standard part and not the specific parts, that's fine. You only wrote what's called the typeface and not the tyreif, that's the specific parts, then it's fine. It's kosher. Now, this understanding falls into the machlekes between Rav Elazar and Rav Meir as to what is the main part of the get. When you do the get, what creates the separation? According to Rav Elazar, it's the writing of the document. The signatures are meaningless. They're just to establish that it was given to her as a record. The writing of it and the giving, that is the main part of the get. And here we're saying the writing also is what's important. It has to be written separated, but the writing only refers to the specific parts, the names, the time, and all that. Now the Gemara's second answer is that we're not in Rav Elazar. In Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Meir says, when the Torah says write a get, the main part of the get is the signatures. The signatures is what makes it into a valid get. Witnesses that sign on it create the get. The writing on it is no big deal. And therefore, when the Mishnah starts off and says, don't write a get while it's attached, it's saying, don't write it, because we're afraid if you write it while it's attaching, you end up signing while it's attached, and that's possible. However, if you did write it while it was attached, and then you separated and signed it later, so the Tanna Kama says that that's okay. Now, Obviously, we saw Rabbi Yehuda argues on that, but the Tanna Kama is going like Rabbi Meir, and he says that that would be all right. All right, now the Gemara goes to slightly different halacha. We said you can't write on something attached. What if you have a flower pot with a hole in the bottom, and there's a tree growing from it, and you want to write it on the flower pot? So the Gemara is going to discuss writing on the flower pot or writing on a leaf growing from that flower pot. So if you wrote it on the clay of the flower pot itself, so the Gemara says that's kosher because you're just going to take the flower pot and give it to her, even though what is in it is viewed as if it's attached to the ground because it's connected through the hole. That's fine. It's not called a separation. You just pick it up and give it to her. Rashi discusses maybe we should be afraid that you're going to break it, and then you have to actually cut it off the flower pot to give it to her. Rashi says he's probably not going to break it because why would he want to destroy a perfectly good flower pot? Now, writing it on the leaf, that's already more complex. And here you have a machlokes between Rava and Abaye. Rava says it's no good because we're afraid you're going to tear off the leaf and give it to her. Now, you wouldn't have to. You could just pick up the flower pot and give it to her, and then it's not being cut. We don't view picking up the flower pot as cutting it off the ground. And it would not violate the halacha that you have to be able to give it as soon as you write it, and it can't be a mandatory, there can't be a required cutting in between. So Rava says it's possible anyway because we're afraid you're going to pick off a leaf. Abaye says it's kosher. You're not afraid he's going to pick up a leaf. He's just going to pick up the flower pot and give it to her, and that won't be a problem of having to do something in between the writing and the giving.